Yeah, so welcoming you all back to session number 3 with Dana Visalli. And hopefully, in your email reminder today about this presentation, you saw that there are 2 links available for the previous sessions that you can watch on YouTube if you missed something or want to go back and see something again. But thank you all for being here, and thank you, Dana. Um, and yes, this session is going to be the incredible journey of human evolution. So we look forward to it, Dana. When you're
Thanks,
ready, go
Donna.
for it.
Yeah, well, I'm as ready as I'm going to get. Yeah, so this is a big story, and it's a story I'm familiar with. I've even given similar slideshows before, but I find myself challenged to remember the content that goes with these slides. So I'll just have to improvise and do my best. I like this cartoon. Obviously, it's rather entertaining, and we're all staring at a computer screen right now, just like the guy on the right. But the amazing thing is that we almost never think about the fact that we are on an evolutionary journey and we are products of an evolutionary journey and we are part of an evolutionary journey. And I like it when I remember it. And I tend to remember it when, I look at the stories like this, that life on the planet has evolved and humanity has evolved. So that's a chimpanzee over there on the left. It's got a scientific name, Pan troglodytes. Pan means god of the fields, must be Greek. Pan probably played the flute. Didn't Pan play the flute? God of the fields, and troglodytes means cave dweller. So this is a god of the fields that lives in a cave. You get a little mileage out of the scientific name and helps you remember them. And not that we need to remember them, but obviously chimpanzees are relevant to the story because we share about 98.5% of the same genes as chimpanzees. We're definitely in the same evolutionary line and definitely closely related. And it's pretty trippy you can pull up any video on chimpanzees. I'm sure there'd be a lot of them on YouTube, and it's a little unnerving because you can see our species and their behaviors. So let's see here. I have coming up on the same slide. So I have the brain sizes there, 40 cubic centimeters, 400 cubic centimeters for a chimp, and 1,300 cubic centimeters for humans. Well, that's about the size of an orange and the size of a grapefruit. And that kind of exemplifies the evolutionary journey. I mean, one of the big things that's happened with our species, Homo sapiens, our species is said to be, I'd say, 300,000 years old when the first Homo sapiens appear in the fossil record, 300,000. Uh, but the increase in brain size goes well back before that. But that is one of the real markers of our species is this big brain. And what do we do with it? I guess is in part some of the subject of this program. So this idea of themes comes from a discipline that many of you are familiar with and some maybe haven't heard of called big history. You could Google big history, you would get a huge Wikipedia page on big history. But big history is just the evolutionary story and trying to put it into terms that we can relate to. So a theme in the evolutionary journey of life is emergence, that new things emerge from old. The best example might be the Big Bang. We don't understand the Big Bang. It's not possible for the human brain to grasp what occurred. But the evidence, because all the galaxies, and there are a lot of galaxies, and that's part of the emergent story, all the galaxies are moving away from one another. Well, if you run them backwards, they all come together. And that means they're all in the same point at some point in the past, which I think is dated actually, accurately or otherwise, to 14 billion years. They were all in the same place. And there was some kind of explosion. Who could understand what? And the universe began with a bang. called the Big Bang. Anyhow, new things emerge uh, constantly. And I must say, given the issues with Homo sapiens on the planet right now, I find the reality of emergence to be a very hopeful phenomenon. New things are constantly emerging. I think I had examples, but I can't remember what they are. Uh, so an example of emergence, I can't dwell on any one point because there's a whole list here, see, that goes on and on. But this one's interesting to me. There was no oxygen in the early atmosphere. And the oxygen is put in the atmosphere by photosynthesis, which is, a metabolic process conducted by plants, where they take in carbon dioxide and water and they rearrange things and they capture the energy of the sun and they give off oxygen. Well, we could not live without that oxygen. So without plants, there'd be no oxygen in the atmosphere. There would be no animal life. There'd be no humans. It's an emergent property. Things emerge over time. New things that didn't used to exist. The universe passes definable thresholds. Certainly, we can say the Big Bang was a threshold. There was nothing, and then there was quite a few things. But there are other thresholds easily identified. I'm going to have to look. There were no stars. There was hydrogen, but there were no stars. The hydrogen was drawn together by gravity and smashed together so convincingly that it began to um, merge into helium and give off light and energy. And so that's a threshold. There were no stars in that. Now there are uncountable number of stars, not just in the sky, but throughout the universe. There was no life on the planet. Thresholds. Is that spelled right? Thresholds. So this is a strange one, but it's worthy of note. The power of the self center. All it's a dangerous universe, and everything eats. And that means whatever is alive and eats has to eat something else that was recently alive. Sometimes they have to kill it. Sometimes they don't. When we go to Hanks, we don't have to kill them. But they were live organisms at Hanks. So this self-protectiveness has arisen. And I bring it up because it's a powerful force in the human journey in trying to figure out what our place is on the planet, perhaps in the universe, but we could start on the planet. And an example of that is that when the scientist Copernicus in the 1500s, 1543, was able to demonstrate that the Earth went around the sun rather than the sun going around the Earth. And if you think about it, it looks like the sun goes around the Earth. It comes up in the east and it goes down in the west. And it goes this big circle and it looks like it's going around the Earth. So maybe reality is counterintuitive. The Catholic Church was outraged and threatened him with death and sentenced him to household arrest for the rest of his life for saying that the Earth went around the sun. There's just the self-center is constantly interfering with the reality uncovered by science. And it's almost the assignment of science to find a way to bypass this obstruction. It's just so powerful. So thought. So it struck me while I put this in here that I am making sounds with my vocal cords that is transmitting some kind of concept to your brain, and you're receiving it and interpreting it, but it's just sounds. There's no inherent meaning in the sounds I'm making, but we have this power of the brain and symbolism in the brain, which we're not usually conscious of, but it's good to bring it up, that now shapes our lives. So I have a favorite wise man. His name was Krishnamurti. He died quite a while ago. And it may not even be worth mentioning his name, but he talked about human consciousness, and he points out the word tree is not a tree. There is no word that is the thing that we mean when we say the word. And I think we have a tendency to get lost in the words. Thought almost never stops. We think constantly. So it's just something to be aware of. That's all I would want to say about it. Ecology. Well, ecology is a fairly new word. I think it was coined in the late 1800s, so it hasn't been around that long. It means the interrelationship of really all things, living things and the planet itself, the interrelationships. And it's an emergent property of the universe. There was no ecology before there was a dynamic planet, which the planet had to emerge from the dynamics of the universe, and life emerged. We don't know how. Now there is something like 5 million species on the planet. They interact, they interrelate, and it's an emergent property. And ethics is an interesting one. So, does right and wrong exist? I'm not going to go anywhere with this in this program, but it's a point of interest. The universe started out with hydrogen. Hydrogen and helium. That's thought to be all that existed after the Big Bang. How did ethics evolve from hydrogen? I think it's a good question. Is there a trajectory? Is there a direction? Well, we might not want to think it might sound like talking about religion or God, but I would say there is a trajectory, and that's to increasingly complex increasingly complex organisms and relationships. And my favorite example might be life started out, we don't know how it started out. It started out as a single cell, a different kind of cell than our cell. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Now there is the largest animal that has ever existed on the planet is a blue whale, and it has a quadrillion cells, which is 1,000 billion. So complexification is a direction. Where are we going with this? So this is a hydrogen cloud. In the beginning, supposedly, there was just hydrogen and helium. It's hard to, understand any of this stuff. We take it in as best we can. But hydrogen has a little bit of mass, and that means it has a little bit of gravity. And the hydrogen atoms started to pull themselves in together. They were in a cloud. They started to pull themselves together because of the gravity. They started smashing into one another and creating so much heat and friction that they began to merge together into helium atoms. And so all this stuff didn't exist in the early universe. I like to say, and I think I might have said this last time, this is our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, but you cannot take a picture of the Milky Way galaxy because we're in it. You can't get out of it. This is the Andromeda galaxy, which you can actually see with your bare eye, barely, on a dark night. And it's fun to be able to see it. It just looks like a little fuzzball. It doesn't look like this. But the Andromeda galaxy is big. These are stars. The Andromeda galaxy is made up out of, I think, these are the kind of numbers that are hard to remember, but certainly at least 400 million stars in the Andromeda galaxy, none of which used to exist, all of which are made out of hydrogen gas clouds, which coalesce because of gravity and ignited. And it's 200. Trying to remember the number, and I don't think I can find it. It's many, many light years across. Light travels at 96,000 miles per second, and they measure distances in light years. How far would you, if you went 96,000 miles a second for a year, this is thousands of light years across. So we're dealing with phenomena that are just incomprehensible to us. There was no Earth in the early universe. There was no moon. The moon is actually made out of the Earth. You may know that. There's an interesting article in The Naturalist on how the moon was formed because the moon is an important part of the dynamics of the planet. It creates the tides that wash the shores and increase the diversity in the shallows of the oceans. It stabilizes the Earth planet, but there was no moon and there was no Earth. The elements of the Earth, I think that the number one element in the Earth taken as a whole is iron. Well, there was no iron in the early universe. It was made by that fusion process that we briefly touched on in stars. Stars are fusing smaller elements into larger elements. It's an emergent universe. New things are emerging. There was no iron, iron emerged. There are many other elements, but iron is a dominant one, not in the Earth's crust, but in the Earth as a whole, in the mantle and in the core. Well, there was no moon. Where did the moon come from? The moon, it's widely agreed upon in the scientific community that in the early history of the Earth, 4 billion years ago, the Earth was hit by a planetesimal. So something bigger than an asteroid. Planetesimal is a small planet. Small planet ran into a bigger planet. It blew part of the Earth's crust out into space. It was such a massive explosion that debris went into orbit around the Earth and then coalesced into the moon. So there is this, it comes up, there's a slide that comes up later on extinctions because there have been 5 major mass extinctions in the history of the Earth where large percentages of living organisms died from some dramatic event. And then after that, life flourished after the extinction event in new forms. So I might say it too often. I don't know if I can. The Earth is a strange place. There's far more to life on Earth than meets the eye. And it's got transcendent qualities that add meaning to life. We're a part of something very special. And so to me, this is an advantage that there could be no moon. But the moon is sort of perfect. The moon is sort of perfect for the Earth. It increases biodiversity because of the gravity on the tides. It stabilizes the Earth. It stabilizes the Earth's orbit around the sun. It keeps it from wobbling so much, which increases the viability of the Earth for living organisms. And it happened by chance. I mean, it seemed by chance a planetesimal smashed into it. So I think maybe we're talking about trajectories. Are there trajectories? Can you get any direction out of the evolutionary journey? I think some people would say no, I would say yes. And so this slanted line looks like a trajectory. And that line that goes from the right to the left is the increase in brain size in hominids, humans. Humans are up there on the top left. I have a red dot, pull it up. Red dot on Homo sapiens up there in the upper left. It's an index of braininess. I had to look up braininess. What are they talking about? I think they're talking about the actual size of the brain, which I have over there on the left, the actual size of the brain compared to the size of the body. Our brains are very big compared to, in terms of relative to the size of the body, probably compared to almost any other organism. In this case, only our evolutionary relatives are on the scale. So what's on the scale in the upper top portion there is H. erectus, Homo erectus, H. habilis, Homo habilis. They're in the same genus as us. These organisms, these creatures, of course, do not exist anymore. Homo erectus just went extinct 40,000 years ago, quite recently, and is in our direct evolutionary line, but had smaller brains. The A's down there are Australopithecus, which means southern ape of Africa, Australopithecus. So let's see if my cursor can show anything. Here's Australopithecus robustus. Here's Africanus. The most famous was Australopithecus africanus or afarensis. I forget which is more famous. It means southern ape of Africa. But these are brain size. So here's the trajectory. The brain has gotten bigger and bigger. In fact, it becomes an interesting phenomenon that any of you females in the crowd that have had children, it's hard to get the human head through the birth canal. In fact, the human skull does not solidify. The bones are not cemented together and are flexible because the brain is so big now that it can barely make it through the birth canal. And of course, it continues to grow after that. So it's a trajectory. What all this braininess is good for, that's an open question. So these are relatives. I think it says at the top there. I can't see it. I think you can see it. I have a little extra thing in the way, but it says meet the folks. Meet the folks. So these are, cartoon images of creatures in the human evolutionary line. I have some arrows here that come up. So I just pulled up an arrow over on the left. That's Homo habilis. So Homo habilis was in that trajectory previously. Homo habilis lived, boy, I don't think I could find it. I would say, should have put it in here. I'd say I'm going to guess at 2 million to 4 million years ago. But Homo habilis is in the genus Homo. That means that the scientific community feels that it has enough similarities to Homo sapiens to be put in our direct evolutionary line, and Homo habilis used tools. most animals don't use tools. You have to be able to conceptualize with a brain what you're going to do with the tool. Yeah, some of you have seen pictures of chimpanzees use simple tools. Chimpanzees use a piece of grass. They'll stick it in a termite mound or a termite hole in a tree or an ant hole in a tree and pull out the ants and lick them off the piece of grass. Well, it takes some conceptualization. It takes some planning to do that. Not a huge amount of planning, not like driving to Seattle, but or making the car that you're going to drive in, but it takes some conceptualization. So chimpanzees have that ability. There's a lot of animals that don't appear to have any flexibility in their behavior. It's all programmed. That's an interesting point to me, that one of the outstanding points of the evolution of the brain is flexible behavior. Most behavior for most organisms, include plants, it's programmed. They're just programmed to react to their environment. There's no flexibility. So, Homo habilis, I have some other arrows here. I can't read those things very well. That's Homo erectus. Homo erectus is more recent. The last Homo erectus that we know of was about 40,000 years ago, not that long ago. This is Neanderthals. We've all heard of Neanderthals. That's why he's dressed up in cold weather, because he lived during the Pleistocene Ice Age in Europe and quite a bit beyond Europe. They now put in its own species, Homo neanderthalensis, but very similar. Very similar. I show some skulls later on, and Neanderthals have larger brains than us. How about that? We're now in starting to recede in brain size, and that I drew up another one. It's us, Homo sapiens. This is a excerpt from Charles Darwin's notebook in 1835. So he put out the book, The Origin of Species, in 1859. So say 20 years later than this. But in the early 1800s, he was starting to conceptualize with that big brain that he had, that life had evolved and changed over time. And this is life branching out in different directions. And he has up at the top there, it says, I think. And that's what he thinks. He's using his brain to. So it was Darwin more than anyone else who unraveled, with minimal evidence, really, that life had evolved over time, evolved and changed and branched out like this. So this is a tree of life. It's a simple version, and I warn you that the next picture is a much more complicated version, but you've already seen it because I showed it last week. But this is a tree of life. Well, it starts at the bottom, and I think I circled down there at the bottom. Last universal common ancestor, they abbreviate it as LUCA for last universal common ancestor. Life, it seems, only appeared once. It would have been single-celled. It would have been bacterial in nature. I circled that word up there in the middle left, prokaryotes. Bacteria and archaea have a different type of cell, a simpler cell than our cells. They're smaller, they have no nucleus, they're less organized, they have less complexity in the cell. If you're going to evolve, you might as well start simple. And life started simple, but bacterial cell is not simple. There's another group there called archaea, which are to us, in a microscope, they're somewhat similar to bacteria. I guess evolutionarily and chemically, they're very different than bacteria. I'm just telling you they exist, but they have the same type of relatively simple cell form. Whereas all the organisms that are visible to us up there on the top branch of this tree, so we have algae, we know algae, plants, fungi, animals, which are kingdoms of life, along with bacteria and archaea, have the more complicated type of cell called a eukaryotic cell. It can be 100 times larger than a bacterial cell. The DNA is protected in a nucleus. It's packed full of organelles. I forget the number, but it's huge, of these little factories that have their little assignments inside each individual cell. And gosh, I've looked up many times how many cells in the human body. It's like, I think might be 5 trillion. Uh, It's a magical mystery tour, really. We take it for granted, but we shouldn't. Uh, it's just an astonishing story, the story of life on the planet. So all these things have evolved over time. Here's the more complex picture. So I think I put Luca here in the middle, and this time scale, I'm looking for my, I don't know if you can see my cursor. I should have made that cursor a color. This is 4 billion years ago, 4,000 million years ago, here in the center near where Luca is. And it goes out in both directions. So 300, 3,000. Let's see, what do we have here? 4 billion, 3 billion, 2 billion, 1 billion. Then it breaks down here into millions of years. It's the only point we can really get out of this is how life has complexified over time. So that it started out as a single species. We have no idea how it happened. All I can say is that there is an intense orderliness to the universe. And we talked about that last week. The fact that if you look at a single hydrogen atom, it's extremely orderly. It has one proton and one neutron. It has an electron shell with one electron, but it holds two electrons. Who made the rules? If you have one electron in your electron shell, there is an electrical propensity, proclivity to attract a second electron to fill that shell. It's built into the order of the universe. So I have a quote. I think I read it last week. I can't find it right now. That life may be an inevitable emergent property of the universe because the universe is so orderly. We're not talking about intelligent design, but it is intelligent. So here are some things. Here are eukaryotic cells. We talked about those in the last slide. Our bacteria and archaea over here on the left are prokaryotes. Everything else is eukaryote, more complicated. And look at the diversity. We can just tell from the complexity of the picture how things have diversified over time. That's the evolutionary journey of life on Earth. What's it all about? Well, what are all the organisms concerned with? This is a fish coming out of the water. It's a cartoon, obviously. Fish coming out of the water. What's it worried about? Eat. Everything's worried about eating. In fact, I have not had lunch and I'm hungry. Survive. Everything eats everything else. It's a little brutal out there. Just read the newspaper and reproduce. If you don't, nothing lives for very long. No offense, but nothing lives for very long. If you don't reproduce, then your genetic line will fade out. For humans, that's not a problem. There are 8 billion of us. You don't have to reproduce, but this is the biological drive. Eat, survive, reproduce, eat, survive. So this is a fish turning into an amphibian, turning into a reptile. This is actually what happened in the true evolutionary story. These things evolved into other kinds of creatures. This is obviously a monkey or a chimpanzee. And then along comes this creature. What's it all about? I remember one fact. I have all these notes, which I'm happily not having to refer to. They're looking 15 pages long. I mean, the story is endless. There's a little fact in there. They've been able to study the activity in the human mind, and I have it written down. I can't vouch for the veracity, but I think it's roughly true. It says that of the activity in the human mind, about 98% of the activity in the human mind goes to keeping the human body functioning. All the brain controls all the body functions. The heart has to beat those many beats a minute. The blood has to circulate. The oxygen has to go into the lungs and get into the blood system and be transported to the cells. We don't know what it does, but it does something. I mean, we do know, but we haven't talked about it. 2% of the mind, they can take scans of some kind and see where parts of the mind line up. 2% of the mind is involved in the questions of what it's all about, philosophical questions, but probably 0% in these other organisms. So it's an emergent property of the universe to question what's going on. I'm gonna have to speed up. Okay, what's it all about? This is energy coming in at the bottom from the sun. The J stands for a measure of energy called joule, Joule, a joule. So here's down at the bottom is 1,000,000 joules of sunlight reach the Earth. I mean, I don't know how many on an actual day, but this is if for every million that reaches the Earth, 1% is captured by plants. 10,000 joules is captured by plants. It's captured in the chemical bonds of plants, photosynthesis, so that the energy of the sun is now available for life. So as that gets passed on, only 10% of the energy at each trophic level, feeding level, at each feeding level gets passed on, so that at the top of the food chain, there's very little energy left for large consumers, large, fierce consumers. So only 10% gets passed on at each level. So here's a grasshopper. He actually eats the plant. Well, he gets 10% of the energy in the plant. A mouse eats a grasshopper. It gets 10% of the energy in the grasshopper. There's not much left for the top of the trophic level. So it's one of the challenges for living organisms is getting enough energy to get through the day, get enough strength to reproduce, because that's in the program. Eat, survive, and reproduce. Well, creatures do pretty well. This is a spotted frog in a mass of eggs. This female only laid this mass. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm doing circles around this egg mass in front of the frog. That's her egg mass. But even that one egg mass has 500 eggs. These are other egg masses laid by other frogs. And I might have said already, I ran into this quite a few years ago at Aspen Lake, in the shallows at Aspen Lake, where they have spotted frogs, and the spotted frogs reproduce in late April, early May. So this is part of the eat, survive, reproduce. The eat was getting that energy. Survive is you're on your own on that, and reproduce is most organisms overemphasize reproduction. How many eggs would she need to lay to reproduce the parents, herself and her mate? Of course, the answer is 2. And instead, she lays 500 eggs. Well, life is exuberant, and so that's if on average 498 of those eggs and tadpoles that hatch out of the eggs did not perish before reproducing, the world would fill up with frogs. And this is true for many organisms. They have far more offspring than can survive, and most of them die. They go to feed the biosphere. Other organisms are going to eat those eggs, and it's as if life supports itself. There's an evolutionary phenomenon here, and that is that as in that line of organisms, I would say the number of offspring decrease and the level of parental care increases, which is very touching to me. Frogs do not take care of their tadpoles. Frogs lay the eggs and leave. They probably would eat a tadpole if they could catch it. It could be their own tadpole. They wouldn't know it. They don't have a very big brain. There's not much in that little dent right there. But as life has evolved, the degree of parental care has increased over time. And I find that to be rather touching. There's another aspect to life, and that is random violence. So there's this evolutionary journey which has been very orderly and steady over time. Think back to that shrub that I showed of the diversification of life over time. The planet has been hit. There have been major, major extinction events. I have it. I forget if it's not quite here. I think it's the next slide. But we've been hit by extraterrestrial rocks that have caused extreme damage to life. So there are no guarantees. So this is an asteroid. I have the numbers. Can't remember what they are. It was like 40 miles across. It was traveling like 40,000 miles an hour. It smashed into the Gulf of America. Hopefully you see the humor in that. The Gulf of America 65 million years ago, and sent so much debris up into the atmosphere that it blocked the sun for several years, and the photosynthetic process, which is where food comes from, collapsed. And there was a major, major die-off because of this asteroid strike. And that is thought to be when the dinosaurs went extinct. In fact, there is, I don't know if any of you want to write down and explore, but there is a site in one of the Dakotas, I forget if it's North or South Dakota, called the Tanis site, Tanis, and they find enormous amounts of evidence of this asteroid strike and massive die-offs of animals in this excavation at the Tanis site in Dakota. So this is a graph of life over 6 600 million years. So 600, there's a 600 down here in the lower left. That's 600 million years ago. Well, there was something called the Cambrian explosion 600 million years ago, and it wasn't like a Big Bang explosion. It was an explosion of life. Life just took off in this way, in the way that this line shows life increasing dramatically from 500 million years ago, 400 million years ago. So that's a trajectory. Life has increased dramatically over the history of the planet. But there are other trajectories, or it's not really a trajectory, but other dynamics at play, and one of them is these extinction events. So these little lightning bolts are extinction events through time. The Silurian extinction event up here says Silurian. That's one of the periods. Carboniferous extinction event. The biggest of all time was at the end of the Permian, right here. It's thought that some huge number, I think 90% of all life in the ocean went extinct. It, a large portion. This was the end of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Oops, that's not right. Cretaceous. Cretaceous. Here's the end of the dinosaurs. In any case, it was a major extinction event. So life is dangerous. There's just no way around it. You better, have a nice day. Taxonomic. Just a reminder of how this works. So if we were, and I don't think I remember. This is Homo sapiens. I'm gonna pull them up here. But I can't even get them all after putting this together myself. I don't know. It's just hard to remember things. But we know what kingdom we're in, right? We in the plant kingdom, we're in the fungi, or in the animal kingdom. Phylum. Well, that has to do with backbones. So we can kind of guess at this one, something to do with backbones. So I think we're in the chordata. Yeah, chordata. So all animals with backbones would be in that phylum. Class, I'm lost. Mammalia. So we're in class Mammalia. It's just the way this is really an evolutionary branching. Some animals produce milk, and they're called mammals, and other animals don't, and they're not called mammals. Some animals, some animals evolved to supply huge amounts of nutrients to their um, in utero offspring. They have placentas. Other animals don't have placentals. Some animals are born highly undeveloped. Some animals are laid in eggs. Homidae. So Homidae is interesting. I keep trying to remember this. We're in the family Homidae. We're not alone. There are 8 species of great apes, and we're in the same family as those apes, which means we're very closely related. Probably 98% genetically the same. Great apes. So these things are so hard to remember. I've worked hard to do this. They're called these orangutans. How many orangutans are there? Well, I happen to know from reading my notes about 10 times there's 3 species of orangutans. How many gorillas? 2. So we're up to 5. How many chimps? 2. Because remember, there's bonobos. We probably all remember there are bonobos. We're up to 7, and we're number 8. Family, tribe. So it's thinning things out here. They threw out the orangutans and the gorillas, and we're down to chimps and bonobos and humans. Genus, Homo. So an interesting thing about the Homo genus is there have been 15 species of Homo. How many are there now? 1. Where'd the other ones go? They died out. We're going too slow. I knew this would happen. This is complicated. Well, we can speed up, but mammals have, how do mammals end up in the classification that they end up in? Class. See, they're in class here, mammals. Well, a primary thing is they produce milk. So interestingly enough, there are mammals that don't have nipples. They don't have breasts. The milk just they are considered to be earlier evolved animals, like I think echidnas, which come up here, and the duck-billed platypus. They produce milk, but it just oozes out of a pore, and the offspring, which are born poorly developed, undeveloped, lap it up, lap it up. So you can see an evolutionary journey here. And also, I thought the size difference was worthy of note. So these are all mammals. The smallest mammal probably in the world is this mouse lemur, and then there's a pygmy marmoset who's not much bigger. The blue whale weighs, Donna, how much does it weigh? I kept looking it up. 200,000 pounds or something like that, or maybe it's just gargantuan. It's the largest animal that has ever lived on the face of the earth. I have in my notes, I happen to remember there used to be about 35,000 of them, and they're down to 15,000 because we kill them and eat them. 200 tons. There, the answer was there. So going through the evolutionary journey of mammals, there are three subclasses. There are monotremes. I have it written there. It means one orifice. Their urinary tract, their defecatory tract, and their reproductive tract, it's all one opening. It's all one opening. It's just the simplest design that God could come up with was to make one opening. And there are, I think, yeah, 5 species of these monotremes, one of which is a duck-billed platypus, which is quite the character, as you may know, but is considered to be an early mammal. And these things are they're mostly from Australia. There are echidnas. I'm trying to go back and failing here. Platypus is only in Australia. Echidnas are in Australia and New Guinea. These are geographical areas of the world that were isolated from the continents. And so there wasn't much competition, there wasn't much interaction. And so their evolutionary journey was slowed down. And so these early examples of mammals still exist in places like New Guinea and Australia. Marsupials, we know about marsupials. So evolutionarily, they supply more care to their offspring. They have nipples, but the offspring are helpless. They're not in utero very long. I have written there a kangaroo when it's born is the size of a honeybee and goes in the pouch and attaches to the nipple and develops there. I don't know quite what the evolutionary advantage is. We could figure it out or we could read about it. It's to say our group, which is here, the placentals, which refers to the placental, which feeds the offspring in the uterus for a long period of time so that it's born more developed and probably enhances its survival capacity. There's a tendency in the evolutionary journey for organisms to have fewer offspring, like the spotted frog has 500 eggs, and we might have, at most humans might have 10 children, more likely 2 or 3. Uh, but there's the level of parental care goes up astronomically from nothing in more early evolved organisms to enormous, as any parent can attest, vast amounts of parental care. In offspring, think of our children. They hang around for a long time. So I guess this is a bonobo. And I put down here as kind of a joke. Any resemblance of bonobos to Homo sapiens is purely coincidental because the joke is they're very closely related to us and, have interesting behavioral characteristics. They're very sexual, as you probably know. And they use sexuality as a social tool. The bonobos do more than the chimps do. But so the mammal line, primates. That's our evolutionary line. Here are some smaller primates, creatures we barely know exist: aye-ayes, lorises, potos, tarsiers, marmosets. These are all in our evolutionary line, and the amount of genetic similarity would be quite high. I'd bet it would be 97%. Primate is our evolutionary line. And by the way, the word means number one, named in all humility by Homo sapiens. uh, Characteristics of primates. Well, opposable thumbs, you wouldn't think of that. I wouldn't have not thought of that, but that is a characteristic of primates. With an opposable thumb, you no longer are using your hands just for running. You can grasp things. If you can grasp things, you can start to manipulate things. I think there's a connection to the evolutionary journey of the brain. It increases challenges to the brain, the opposable thumb. So it's not something we necessarily think about, but it's a major feature in primate line. And other things are listed there. Stereoscopic vision, forward-facing eyes. A lot of creatures have eyes. Think of a deer. The eyes are on the side of the head. It can see behind it. It can see behind it to know if it's being pursued by a predator, a deer, but it doesn't have stereoscopic vision, which means it doesn't have depth perception. it can get away from the predator because it saw it, but it doesn't have depth perception, so it can't see the world in the same way that primates can. This is still our evolutionary line, the great apes. There are three species of orangutans, two of gorillas, one chimp, one bono, and one homo. Uh, Hominids, I'm pretty sure. These are hominids, a step beyond primates. So this is the point here is that there's an interaction between the biogeosphere, there's an interaction between the planet and the evolution of life. And the suggestion here is that the last 2 million years on the Earth have been uncharacteristically unstable. So that is a graph of temperature over the last 180 million years, starting on the right and going to the left. That instability and blue color over on the left, all that jagged, which I'm going to blow up here in another picture, is the Pleistocene Ice Age. There were 20 glacial advances in the last 2.5 million years. It was an acharacteristic instability in the Earth's climate. Well, life has to adapt to the Earth as it is, and the Earth is always changing. So life had to adapt to this new reality. I'm trying to bring up those are years, 180 million years ago to 1.8 million years ago to the present. I didn't circle the present. Here's a blow up of the Pleistocene period from 800 million years ago to the present. The thing is, that's going to spur biological change over time. All the organisms that existed when this instability occurred had to adapt and adapt both physically but also genetically. It's going to be selected for genes that allow it to adapt to this changing climate. And it's thought that at the beginning of the Pleistocene, it's actually one of the drivers was the Himalayas rising up because the Indian subcontinent floated through the Indian Ocean and smashed into Asia and pushed up the Himalaya mountains. It changed the climate so that the forests in Africa became drier and the trees disappeared. So there's a saying that it's not that the predecessors to humans, it's not that they, how's it go? It's not that they left the trees left them. The trees left them, and they had to adapt to life on the savannah. So these are considered to be predecessors in the family line. You remember, you've heard of this person, this Australopithecus that they named Lucy because the Beatles song was playing in a tent when they brought that fossil in Africa. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, 3 million years old, but one of the first fossil organisms to stand up on 2 feet, to become bipedal, which frees the hands. If you're walking on 2 feet, then you have hands. What can you do with hands? Well, you can start to fashion things with your opposable thumb. You can start to make tools. I think Australopithecus made a very few simple tools, nothing like later organisms. Oh, yeah. So I like this thing. This is the Makapanska pebble. It's a famous pebble found in a cave in South Africa. I forget when. I think in the 1900s. And I was able to buy it. I have it here. I have the Makapanska pebble, but it's too much responsibility for me, so I'm willing to sell it for $1,000. No, I'm just joking. I made this out of clay. I made it out of clay to bring to river camp to talk to the kids about the Makapanska pebble because this pebble was found in a cave 50 miles away from where this kind of rock outcrop is. So some creature, there's evidence Australopithecus lived in this cave. That's a known fact. An Australopithecus evidently picked this rock up, carried it 50 miles from the rock outcrop to the cave because it resembles a hominid. It resembles our genetic line. It's one of the first examples of symbolic thought in the hominid line, in the homonym line. I'm going to say homonym. Early predecessors to humans. That's the only reason they would bring that thing home. but life for the early creatures was dangerous. So this is an Australopithecus skull found in a cave with two holes in it. It wasn't known why those holes were there until they realized it lapped up. It lined up with the canids on a leopard. And the interpretation is that these creatures were helpless. If you think about it, especially Australopithecus, they barely were able to fashion tools. Uh, they weren't good runners. I think, yeah, they didn't have fire. They had to get through every night. They're weak compared to the carnivores. Think of what life was like for these creatures. And so they were prey. They were prey species. And that is in our evolutionary line. In my mind, maybe I shouldn't say this, but it's why the kinds of wars we have today exist, because we have this fear of the danger out there in the larger world, now represented by other human beings. So that was Australopithecus. This is Homo habilis. It lived about 2 million years ago. It had a brain that was bigger than Australopithecus, but our brain size is about 1,300, so twice the size of Homo habilis. But it started to fashion tools. Well, fashioning tools is a mental creation. You have to be able to imagine at the beginning what you want at the end of the process. You have to think into the future. You have to project into the future with your mind. And Homo habilis was able to do this and create simple tools like are shown here. Homo erectus has a larger brain, up to 1,200 cubic centimeters. Ours is 1,300. So Homo erectus the brain size was increasing. Their complexity of their tools increased, and Homo erectus is the first creature to use. I thought the slide was here. This is Homo erectus skull, Homo sapiens skull. So an interesting point here actually that's made in this picture is the jaw is receding from Homo habilis, which is not pictured here, Homo erectus on the left, Homo sapiens on the right. The teeth are smaller, the jaw is smaller. Why? Because Homo erectus tamed fire, which might come up here. Homo erectus figured out that they could actually make a friend out of the wildfires that burned across the African savanna. They could bring the fires back to camp and they could cook their food. When you They were meat eaters. They knew how to make weapons. When you cook anything, you cook meat or plant material, I mean roots, you increase the nutritional value of the food, the available nutrients in the food. So this made more nutrients and more energy available to the body, and the brain continued to grow. So our evolutionary history is integrally tied with fire. There's a book called Catching Fire, which is really fun to read. It's about the fact that fire is implicated in the growth of our brain because it made more energy available. This is energy use through time by humans. Down at the bottom, let's see if I circled anything. So down at the bottom is 2,000 kilocalories, 2,000 kilocalories per day. That's what the human body uses, roughly speaking. When we eat, we take in 2,000 kilocalories. So hunter-gatherers went up to 5,000 calories. How did they do that? By harnessing fire. They're utilizing the energy in fire to improve their lives. Safer at night. Predators can't get them. It's warmer at night. They can cook their food, make more food, more nutrients available. Well, look at what's happened over time. Agricultural, why it's at 12,000. I don't have any more circled, but agriculture is 12,000 kilocalories a day. That is harnessing draft animals. The draft animals are now doing the work for humanity. And it goes up to 230,000 calories a day. How did modern humans get to 230,000 kilocalories a day? What's the answer? Fossil fuels. It's said that we all have 200 slaves working for us every day. That's the energy embodied in fossil fuels. And I don't go into it in the slideshow. I might in that last one, but fossil fuels are a finite resource. They are the condensed energy of the sun that have been preserved in fossil formations in the earth from millions of years ago. and they won't last forever. I did circle. So this is a skull found in somewhere in Georgia, in the country Georgia, former part of the Soviet Union. Dmanisi skull. Trying to remember if this is a Homo sapiens or Homo erectus. I forget which one it is. But this is a toothless old man, old at 40, by the way. That was very old at that time. But his teeth had fallen out, and the sockets had grown in with the bony structure from his jaw, which means that somebody took care of this man. He could not chew food. He had no teeth. It's the first sign of empathy in the fossil record, or one of the first signs of empathy in the fossil record, that somebody had to take care of this man to allow him to live to the age of 40 with no teeth. Homo erectus. So our genus, but not our species, came out of Africa, spread throughout what I would call the old world, throughout Asia, Europe, into Western Europe. Homo erectus. I'm going to have to speed up here. Well, this is an interesting point I want to make. So this Tong child over on the left is a skull found in Africa in 1924, and it was pivotal because it suggested it was human-like. It was an Australopithecus, but it was human-like. It suggested that humans evolved in Africa. Prior to that, it was assumed that humans evolved in Asia and or Europe, but certainly not in Africa, because it would mean that the first humans were black. This is the ego again. It's a major player in all human interpretation of the world. And Europeans, it was rejected out of hand that this could in any way be in the human evolutionary line, this Tong child. And instead, this skull was found in Europe, in England, a few years later, I think, called Piltdown Man. And it proved that humans had actually evolved in Europe, in England, but it was a fraud. It was a fraud made up by some scientists, paleontologists, who put together a human skull, an orangutan jaw, and chimpanzee teeth, if I remember that correctly. So they got the big brain and the weird teeth, the evolutionary journey. They just made it up because for some reason, our species is sometimes content with myth. We're content with myths. If they embellish our sense of self, we love them. And it's like a danger signal flashing that we can't really very well discern truth from fraud. So we're just going to skip through this. This is interesting because it's Neanderthals, which are Homo neanderthalensis. They're in the same genus, now considered a different species, but they buried their first evidence of burial in a Homo line. This is only 40,000 years ago in this cave in Iraq. And they know they buried him. The bodies are laid down in a particular way that they were buried, but there's flower pollen. So they strew flowers over the grave. That is a product of conceptual thinking and the continued evolution of the evolutionary mind. The brain has gotten bigger over time. We're speeding up here, but so the shells were jewelry. They were strung on a string and worn around the neck. That's a product of the mind, conceptualizing whatever the concept was. If it was to beautify a male or a female, we don't know. Same with the lines in that rock. Modern humans came out of Africa to the chagrin of the English. I like this picture. This is a picture of a Cro-Magnon. This is still Homo sapiens, but continued evolution in Europe. This guy has sunglasses on, but glasses, but it's just a joke. But this is not a joke. This is a product found in a cave in Germany, 40,000 years old, and it just shows the continued symbolic activity of the human mind. There are no other animals that make statues of themselves or, this exaggerated aspects of the human reproductive process, the big breasts and such. This is a flute found I think in a cave in Germany. So they were making music, all products of this evolutionary process of the human mind, something like 5,000 beads, each of which took an hour to make, adorning this burial in Russia 30,000 years ago. Cave art, we're familiar with cave art, but it hasn't been known all that long. I forget the year, but about 100 years we've known about this cave art. But why were these people going into caves and creating these symbols on the wall? This beautiful piece of art that I like so much from Chauvet Cave in France. So we're done. But this is, I think, if I showed this before, but this was for most of the history of humanity, we thought we were the center of the earth. And to our great disappointment, we weren't. And I don't even remember that slide. I don't know where that came from. Oh, I see. This is Easter Island. It is, I think the next slide's the last slide. But these are MOAs. You probably vaguely remember or well remember this story. There were 500. These things weighed tons. And somehow Homo sapiens got to this isolated island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and were isolated there and created these cultures of ancestor worship. So these were, but it's all symbolic. And then they fought over it. And then the different tribes on this little island started fighting over one another and knocking over these moas. But it's all symbolic activity of the mind. It had nothing to do with survival. It's like the symbolism had transcended survival. So yeah, this is the last slide except for a picture of the Earth, the next one. But some other indications of the symbolic activity of the mind in the upper right is the Earth at the center of the universe. It was such a disappointment when we found out we weren't the center of the universe. The lower left is Jesus appearing in a tortilla. This is one, they're burn marks. I mean, that is manipulated, but people believe that Jesus appeared in a tortilla. That's a nuclear bomb. So the symbolic activity of the mind, it interprets things fairly accurately in terms of the dynamics of the universe. Our concepts about atoms are functional. We can fuse atoms together and make hydrogen bombs. It's amazing to me that works, but we don't have the wisdom that goes with the scientific insight. And that's a graph of, not trying to depress you here, but rate of extinction of life on the planet over time because the impact of this big-brained primate known as Homo sapiens is trying to find its place on the planet. That planet. Look how beautiful that is. So it is, I think, mystical, not mythical. It's a mystical planet. There are many mystical aspects to our life. The end. Oh, only 4 minutes overtime.
Good job. Good job. Thank you so much, Dana. It
You're
is, yeah, an amazing amount of information.
going
And
back to
thank
that
you
one.
so much for all your time putting this together for us. Very much appreciated. And I loved your recommendation of the book Catching Fire. I looked it
Yep.
up really quickly. The author is Richard Wrangham. That
Hang him,
sounds
yeah.
like an interesting read.
Good book.
Yeah. And I don't see any questions in the chat, but I will just remind everyone that if you do have questions for Dana, he's open to receiving emails at it's dana@metownet.com. So appreciate you being available. We had a sad but true cartoon shared with us by Jerry that just shows if you want to look in your chat evolution of life coming out of the water, and then sadly, us humans dumping trash into the water.
Oh yeah, I've seen cartoons
Um,
like that. Yeah.
yeah, which to Dana's point, yeah, we're trying to figure out our place on this beautiful planet and how to save it from ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything you want to share for next week? Trailer?
So a trailer, right? 30-second trailer. Let's see. So it's on ecology, and I put the word ethics in there, and I don't know what I'll do with it. It's a dangerous word, but mostly ecology, the interconnectedness of the Earth itself and the life on it is not immediately evident to us. It's invisible, like the oxygen in the atmosphere that we breathe that comes from plants. We're not really aware of it. We're barely aware of breathing, but there is a very tight ecological connection between all living organisms on the planet. So I will
Mhm.
try and address that.
Okay, that sounds very interesting. Well, thank you all for joining. Thank you so much, Dana, for this presentation, and we'll look forward to seeing you next Tuesday at noon.
Thanks, Donna.
Bye.
Go get some sunshine.
Yeah, everyone enjoy the sun.